Hello, comrades. Welcome to Commie Reading Group, Stream 9. Today we'll be beginning the conclusion of Capital's Grave by Jodi. So let's get started. Conclusion. The Servant Vanguard. Capitalism isn't immortal, although from time to time it's depicted as undead. It had a beginning and will have an end. The beginning of this mode of production lasted several centuries and was a violent, bloody process, inexcusable from colonialism and slavery. Its ending appears to be approaching more quickly, if no less violently. Hoarding, predation, and destruction are replacing competition, investment, and improvement as primary drivers of wealth accumulation. In the 1970s and 80s, we were told that information technology and services would expand the number of white-collar jobs, value creative and highly educated labor, and resulted in growth and prosperity for all. An advanced capitalist knowledge economy would place industrial commodity production. That's not quite the way it turned out. Deindustrialization and deagralization led to global rise in services, but the vast majority are unwaged, low paid, informal, and precarious. The array of services is broad, from the financial, legal, real estate, and insurance services associated with the much mangled professional managerial class, to cleaners, security guards, delivery drivers, and home health aides struggling to bring home enough to cover endlessly increasing rent. In much of this stagnant sector, growth is slow, dependent more on suppressing wages and pushing workers than on technological innovation. With the bulk of jobs consisting of low skill, low productivity personal services, inequality intensifies. The many locked into serving the few. Most of us are minions now. Proletarianized neo-serfs, tethered to the phones, apps, platforms, and personal connections, we need to access basic means of substance. The few use their political and economic power to seize enough larger portions of the proceeds of labor, evading public law while subjecting us to their private dominion. We are exploited through the wage that is further exported from us via ever-increasing rents, fines, charges, and fees. The Marxist hope was the capital was digging in its own grave by building up massive means of production. Not only would industrialization and scarcity provide abundance and enable us to meet social needs, but the concentration of workers in central locations would generate the class consciousness necessary for rising up against and defeating the owners of capital. Even more, liberal democracy, the legal and political system developed by the bourgeoisie to protect their interests, would help the proletariat develop the political skills necessary for struggle and victory. While Marxists have always disagreed on the extent to which participation in bourgeoisie democratic proletariat monetary policy politics could lead to socialism, few has discontinued the importance of literacy, voting rights, political participation, and party formation to development of proletarian political consciousness. By burying capitalism, the working class would make real for everyone the promises of freedom, equality, and justice that the liberal bourgeoisie have reversed for owners of property. 40 years of neoliberalism have undermined these ideals. A harsh winner-take-all economy eviscerated the social democratic welfare state. Health, education, green space, clean air, and clean water are still available as private goods for those who can pay for them. The same holds for justice. Able to retain armies of lobbyists and attorneys to fight their battles, the rich evade responsibility. The laws subjecting the many to surveillance, harassment, debt, and fines don't apply to them. It's no wonder that disproportionately, disparately, and privileged have become primary terms in the contemporary language of grievance and redress. Hey Greg, how you doing? We're just on the conclusion of Capital's Grave right now. Good to see you. Someone is also always ahead of us, getting more than they deserve, more than they share. What can equally even mean in a society of nuanced hierarchical graduations? Equal to what? In the US, this is what democracy looks like. Stolen elections, politically indistinguishable candidates, and the static outrage of a civil war, whereas in Thucydides' description in his history of the Peloponnesian War, words have changed their ordinary meanings. Free markets and free speech have developed into communicative capitalism, subjectation of communication to the logic of market competition. Circulation values displace use value, and platform owners determine what circulates. Freedom has become dependence. All that has melted into air, a fetter more solid than iron. Living in transition from capitalism to neo-feudalism, we have to be attuned to overlapping forms and contradictory logics, to the ways that the same processes fit within fundamentally different modes of production and accumulation. Such attunement is deserved by the localism and anti-statementism uniting communitarians and libertarians left and right. Sovereignty isn't the problem. Ours is an age of suzerainty, where deals between the powerful easily override even the smallest popular victories. Privatized jurisprudence jurisprudency. I don't know. Fragmentation into zones and tech companies more powerful than most state governments alert us to parcellated sovereignty's new conditions of struggle. Impersonal conditions of perpetually displaced accountability wherein personal power thrives. social and ecological reproduction crises in the hinterlands. Hinterlands performing as well as surrounding thriving cityscapes in the psychotic atmosphere of anxiety, rivalry, and aggression reveal the class conflict characteristics of the social manner. No longer confined with the hidden abode of production, it pervades consumption and circulation as ever multiplying fees and fines prey on our lives and features. The sector of servants doesn't feel like what we've been told class should feel like. What is the solidarity? Instead of finding safety in numbers, we are left to go it alone, fighting our own battles not to get ahead but just to survive. Nearly all servants have to sell their labor power to survive. Not all. Since some of the lawyers and hedge managers have hoards significant to retire in luxury, but we hold on to status differences for dear life. Our labor power sells below its value. With brands as our seals, we construct new ones as influencers, frequent flyers, and preferred customers with elite status and VIP access to the most exclusive restaurants, lounges, and hotels. Just as proximity to the lord or king mattered in a feudal age, so does gradations in fame and privilege preoccupy those who no longer see equality as a measure of justice. This is a grim picture. Fortunately, it's not an eventful. I always struggle with this damn word. Um, inevitable. My story of the new feudalizing tendencies in contemporary capitalism describes the way things will proceed if we don't develop the political will and capacity to push in a communist direction. I conclude by considering ideas of the far that reinforce neo-feudalism and locating possibilities for combating it. We aren't doomed to being buried alive in capital's grave. The sector of servants contains a vanguard that can lead to the way out of it. Now we're going into beyond subsistence. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, scholar activists did significant work documenting the impact of neoliberal globalization. Attentive to the ravaging of communities around the world, they theorized debt, enclosure, accumulation by disposition, planetary uberization, and the rise of global cities. Some of those working and influenced by the Italian tradition of autonomous Marxism found a position alternative to neoliberal globalization in the commons. A generative political and social space separate from the political sphere of the state and the private sphere of family and market. Sylvia Fredericks's contribution was especially influential as it brought out the gender dimensions of neoliberal privatization and developed the idea of commoning as a political and economic practice for generating cooperative social relations. Yet even as her analysis drew crucial attention to the unwaged worker of social reproduction and helped keep alive a vital counter discourse to the hegemonic capitalist one. In retrospect, its limits are apparent. Frederick's assumes rather than contest and neo-feudal order. More precisely, Frederick's account of social reproduction, critique of Marx, and rejection of the state reflect an embrace of pre-capitalist economic and political relations generally associated with feudalism. First, influenced by Mara Rosa della Costa and Selma James, and developed in the course of the wages of for housework campaign. Frederick's analysis of social reproduction emphasizes the productivity of women's unwaged domestic labor. While Frederick's concedes that housework was minimal in 19th century working class homes, she nevertheless repeatedly attacks Marx for ignoring it. He ignores it, she says, because he fails to see it as a value-producing labor. Federici is fully aware of definitions Marx gives to the terms through which he analyzes capitalism. Value refers to exchange value. It designates a quantitative relation between different products of labor. What enables different products of labor to be brought into relation, to be compared and exchanged, is what they have in common, namely labor time. Labor time doesn't refer to how long it takes a particular person to make a particular thing. It refers to an aggregate to the amount of time it takes workers in general to make commodities. What Marx calls socially necessary labor time. The development of manufacturing and industry dramatically decreases the amount of labor time necessary to make virtually every item we encounter in everyday life. They also lead to an explosion of new and combined industrial and technological processes, and to the production of things few of us would have ever imagined we could possibly need. Frederici understands all this, but she asserts that Marx neglects the production of the most important commodity of all, labor power. She acknowledges the justified critique of this move. Women produce living individuals, children, relatives, families, not labor power. But she does so only to dismiss it, just as labor power can only exist in the living individual. So is it equally imposed to draw a line between the two corresponding aspects of reproductive work. That is, the reproduction of the person and of labor power. The human is collapsed into labor. The primary problem with Federici's approach to reproductive labor lies in her treatment of value. That work is necessarily doesn't mean it's productive. It doesn't mean that it produces exchange value. To produce the barrier of labor power is not the same as producing labor power. Just as producing the barrier of clothes is not the same as producing clothes. Treating women's reproductive work as analogous to commodity production, that is, as productive of abstract interchangeable units, misconstrues the character of domestic labor, in effect, providing a new variation of the commodity fetishism Marx so famously theorized. Relations between people taking on the character of relations between things. Speaking of the production of human beings, concedes alienation in advice. Where we might find joy, we discover cogs. Although in English we use the word labor as synonymous with giving birth, we shouldn't confuse sexual reproduction with commodity reproduction. When we have children, we aren't simply producing a labor force for capitalism. We are bringing new possibilities into the world, people who may fight back and change everything. No baby ever did that. Had she acknowledged that caring for others involves necessary but unproductive labor, Federacy might have been able to theorize the way the rise of services open up a path out of capitalism. The household is not a capitalist enterprise organized on the basics of capitalist law of motions. Neither is the issue women's unwaged labor in the home. For millennial poor and enslaved women have nursed the children, bathed the bodies, and scrubbed the floor of the better off. For centuries, the household has been a site of waged as well as unwaged labor. What matters today is that capitalism's reliance on services is contributing to its becoming neo-feudal. Precisely because care and reproduction can't be fully technologized, precisely because technical development results in an ever larger sector of servants. Precisely because caring for people comes up against real limits with respect to efficiency. Nurses can care only for a limited number of patients, for example. A society of servants cannot be a capitalist society. Services require that we think in terms of their use value, not their exchange value. That services have expanded takes up a step towards approaching the economy with an emphasis on meeting social needs, not making profits. It's no accident that all over the world, teachers, nurses, and other service workers have been at the vanguard of the new class struggle. The struggle around social reproduction is real. And it's real because it's about so much more than housework. It's about securing the basic conditions for social and ecological life. As more work has become directed to securing these conditions, and as it remains ill-paid and disconnected from capital accumulation, the ability of service workers to fight back has increased, and will increase. There is nothing world historical about housework. It's part of a realm of necessity rather than freedom. The household doesn't produce great innovations, changes in everyday practice in one spot don't lead to or engender changes elsewhere. For the most part, the work remains roughly the same. Technological developments that result in the production of new commodities can make some tasks easier. Pressures on households to participate in wage labor can make the most tasks harder. Roughly speaking, it's under feudal relations that the household appears as a site of historical significance. Arranged marriages, blood alliances, and court intrigue. Here the personal reality was political. Second, Federacy's critique of Marx centers on her rejection of the idea that there is a progressive dimension to capitalism. Contra Marx, she argues that capitalism has not created a basis for building communism. Instead of leading to abundance, it has an increased scarcity, scarcity. Instead of endangering cooperation, it has inscribed difference. And instead of inciting a revolutionary and victorious proletarian, it has confronted militant indigenous and peasant movements. Federacy's argument is one-sided. Marx insisted on the dialectical character of capitalism. Enormous advances in productive capacity were accompanied by immense deprivation. Cooperation was always interwoven with competition. The victory of the working class was never guaranteed. It was also dependent on political struggle. The Marxist-Leninist tradition is anchored in this fact. Committed to building alliances of workers and peasants, as well as to anti-colonial and anti-imperialist struggle. To present Marxist as nothing but a theory of the industrial working class misrepresents the whole of the 20th century. Federacy rightly observes that there were large-scale forms of production and exchange prior to capitalism. She should acknowledge, though, how these depended on indebted, enslaved, enserfed, conscripted, imprisoned, and coerced labor. Neither the oppression of workers nor wage labor is original to capitalism. Federacy is misleading when she says that capitalism destroyed a society of the commons materially grounded not only in the collective use of land and collective work relations, but in the daily struggle against feudal power, which created new cooperative forms of life. The destruction of the commons was a process internal to feudalism that capitalism turns to their advantage. Federacy is mistaken when she claims that Marx failed to see the that the coexistence of different labor regimes would remain as existential component of the capitalist reproduction. Marx explicitly describes documents the rise of a servant class. Modern domestic slaves, as a coincidence of capitalist exploitation of machinery. One-sided portrayals of capitalism do real harm to contemporary left struggles. The idea that capitalism is purely regressive, that pure capitalist societies were preferable, requires us to think that we would be better off struggling to survive in substance economies. We would have to adapt the concrete that the conceit that penicillin, radios, and electrification are evidence of decline. No one of us who reads and writes today can seriously pretend that our lives would have been much improved had we been born in the 30th century, especially if we are women. I would have died giving birth to my first child. Have I survived the measles, mumps, and meningitis I contracted as a kid? Would I have time to write if I had to make clothes for myself and my children? If I had to gather wood and water every day? Denying any progressive features to capitalism traps us in a pastoral feudal fantasy believed by the multiplicacy multiplicacy multi, multiplicity. I don't know what the. I'm sorry, everyone. I'm really struggling a little today. So traps us in a pastoral feudal fantasy, belied by the. Oh wait, I just read that. Sorry. Of everyday benefits that capitalist industrialization has provided, and of which millions are still deprived. That the devastating environmental and human cost of capitalism are accompanied by things we actually like and have come to need is one of the challenges facing anti-capitalist organizing. To say that this does not dispute the importance of agricultural and pastoral ways of life. Rather, it recognizes the reality of planetary urbanization as well as a real hardship facing agriculturalists and pastoralists on a warming planet. Droughts, fires, floods, excessive heat, excessive rain, disrupted weather patterns, these impact those working closely with nature most of all. Fabrices critique productivist, Promethean version of Marx. Industry and technology will save us all. Freedom comes through the machine. Again, this is one-sided. Perhaps more than anyone else. Marx recognized capitalism's destructive power. The capitalist development of industry has negative consequences for nature as well as workers. The degradation of the conditions of the soil and of the working class life. Overturning capitalism will transform these relations, replacing capitalism compulsion, whereas Fabrices takes the view that capitalist industry, science, and technology cannot be taken over and put to communist use. Marx thinks the associated producers can govern the human metabolism with nature in a rational way, bringing it under the collective control instead of being dominated by it as a blind power. Accomplishing it with the least expenditure of energy and in conditions most worthy and appropriate for their human nature. People together, especially workers, must familiar with the most familiar with the instruments and processes of labor, can rethink and repurpose the technologies around us. We can access the dangers that they present. Consider how these might be mitigated, and then experiment, rank, and choose. Industry and technology developed under capitalist conditions in the interest of capital as a class. These conditions are necessarily conditions of class struggle. Working class power itself affects the shape capitalism takes. Capital's endeavors to increase surplus labor time push it into contradictory situation. It ends up reducing necessary labor time, that is, endangering the conditions where we are free to do much more than work. To think that machinery, technology, and the industry can free up labor time, enable us to spend more time doing what we will, and to imagine a world where we can evaluate, discuss, and determine which machinery, technology, and industry best support the flourishing of the people and the planet is hardly technologistic. When she suggests that it is, Federacy possesses a neo-feudal horizon where a negation of capitalism is a return to subsistence farming. Art is to, labor and small communities. Finally, for decades, Federacy's thought and activism has highlighted developments now discernible as neo-feudalizing. Her work brings our de-aggregation separation of producers from their means of subsistence and workers' dependence on wage work that they are unable to access. Especially attentive to the impact of IMF and World Bank policies of the Global South, she emphasizes the massive scale of land privatization, development of free trade zones, and dismantling of welfare state provisions associated with neoliberal globalization. Across all these, Federacy's tracks the permanent reproduction crisis that capitalism fosters. And yet her solutions remain confined to adaptation and resistance, to insisting on the ongoing significance of community building substance work. Why not seize the state? Abolish private property, and make social reproduction, the thriving of the people and the planet, the purpose of all national and international planning? Well, Federacy's report on women's land struggles around the world demonstrate people's refusal to accept the neocolonial development projects forced on them. Her underlying political presuppositions are neo-feudal. Rejecting politics that target the state, she focused on community in the commons, that is, on fragmented small scale, local face-to-face relations tied to the reproductive labor. The house is to be reclaimed as a center of collective life. The unhoused and migrating don't fit in this vision, and it's difficult to see how apartment dwellers facing evictions might enact such politics. This may be why the union is a popular organization model in today's housing struggles. It established it enables tenants to build the power necessary to come up against landlords and win. Federacy's emphasizes on urban gardening and pooling our resources, affirming approaches to mutual aid and prominent today. They point to how connecting with others in common voluntary work can help end the anxiety and isolation pervading contemporary life. Nevertheless, these approaches remain exclusive, reactive, and limited in their ability to change the conditions out of which they emerge. They remain exclusive because the ideal of community presupposes the connections it aims to build, as if people facing disaster and deprivation necessarily or automatically see themselves and their interests as aligned and can maintain this alignment over the long haul. If that were true, wouldn't we see entire regions, countries, and cities already communizing themselves? Wouldn't the hinterlands be thriving precisely because they've been abandoned by capital? The approaches Federacy celebrates remain reactive because they don't aim to defeat capitalism in its state. Even as she critiques the dismantling of the social welfare state, Federacy doesn't call for its rebuilding or for the reformation of its provisions in the new international communist form. Finally, the approaches of Federacy considers remain limited because the horizon is confined to subsistence conditions on a planet that is making subsistence survival impossible. We can't expect urban gardens and small-scale agriculture to feed 8 billion people so long as the fossil fuel sector continues to drill and temperatures continue to rise. An organized anti-imperialist struggle against the system destroying people and the planet is the only plausible way out of the chronic crises of social reproduction.